That night, July 1st, the 13th Squad was supposed to take its turn up front at the firing trench, from midnight until daybreak. The 14th Squad had the shift before us, but at about 9 p.m. their Corporal Marty from Narbonne said he wasn't feeling well and asked if he and I could switch places. I was happy to oblige. At midnight, the 13th Squad took its post on the firing line. Our 3 newcomers were awestruck. They couldn't believe that they were only 50 meters from the Germans. They didn't dare raise their heads above the parapet. We did our best to calm them down. By that time, Corporal Marty was feeling better, so he urged me to take a break and get some rest. He would go up front with my squad in my place. I stretched out at the widest place in the boyau and had a nice, restful sleep, blissfully unaware of the footsteps of passers-by. Suddenly I was yanked awake by a terrible explosion, followed by cries and moans. In the smoke-filled trench, a man stumbled by, waving his arms in the air, groaning, then collapsing a few steps from me. It was Corporal Marty. "Help me! Don't leave me!" he cried. I lunged toward him. In the light of a lamp which a comrade held up for me, I took a sharp knife and cut through his greatcoat and his shirt, revealing a horrible wound along his left side from which blood gushed in torrents. With a cold-bloodedness which I never thought I had in me, I staunched the hemorrhaging for the time being. Right then, a medical officer and 2 stretcher-bearers rushed up. It was our section chief, Sub-Lieutenant Malvesi, who had gone to get them and had practically dragged them up by force. I have to congratulate this officer for his devotion to duty. I can forgive him for some of the little vexations which he brought upon all of us, and me in particular later on. The medical officer sought to examine the wound, but poor Marty flailed around and cried out even louder, 50 meters from the Germans, who in the calm of this July dawn must have heard everything. "Shut your goddamned mouth," said the medical officer brutally. "What sweet words of consolation when one is on the verge of death, with a shattered body, far from loved ones." "My poor children," cried Marty. He had 3 of them. "I'll never see you again." Then, praying with all his faith, he called upon the Virgin Mary and Saint Teresa, who, he had told me many times, was the protector of wounded men. But alas, no miracle occurred. Death struck down the true believer just as blindly as the unrepentant atheist. Poor Marty expired before he could reach the dressing station. In this war, you see how the tiniest circumstances, the most fortuitous coincidences, can make the difference between life and death. If at 9 p.m. Marty hadn't been suffering from a headache, each of us 2 corporals would have taken his turn at the firing line with his own squad. It probably would have been me whose skin would have been ripped open by a jagged piece of metal. Poor Marty. So complacent, so good, so gentle. Destiny willed that you would die in my place. Forgive me, but I didn't have the time to grieve or to contemplate this death. Blood poured from other men's wounds. They had just found Private Favier lying inanimately. We brought him back to life. His blood flowed from multiple wounds. He was unconscious and already had the death rattle in his throat. I ran in pursuit of the medical officer, the major, who had prudently fled these dangerous places. I led him to the unfortunate Favier. The major felt his pulse for a few seconds. "He's finished," he said. "There's nothing more to do." Before he left, we got him to promise that his stretcher-bearers would come pick up Favier. But it took our sub-lieutenant going to the first aid station to get the stretcher-bearers to come take poor Favier, who died just as he arrived at the field hospital at Hersin-Coupigny. Favier, who had arrived with the latest reinforcements, fell mortally wounded the first night he was on the front line. He had shown great terror in the face of bombardments, and we had to reassure him with encouraging words when we ourselves had much need of being comforted. When he climbed up to the firing step to take his turn at watch, I had to stay near him for a little while. There was no loophole for observing, and in order to do his job of surveillance, he had to stick his head above the parapet. Favier couldn't get used to it. He crouched down each time he heard a bullet whistle past. I suggested that he fill up a couple of sandbags and pile them up to make a crenellation, behind which he would be better protected. The poor guy had listened to me. When we picked him up in the communication trench, at the place where the big shell had fallen, he was holding a sandbag in his arms. I was perhaps the unwitting cause of his death. If I hadn't suggested to him the idea of filling sandbags, he wouldn't have been at the most dangerous spot. Poor Favier, you too. Please forgive me. Now that dawn was beginning to lighten the night sky, those of us who were safe and sound could help the other wounded. First of all was my friend Taut, who, seated on the firing step, was moaning and groaning enough to break your heart, saying that he had a shattered leg. Upon inspection, all we could see was a tiny scratch on his heel, from which not one drop of blood had flowed. We teased him for being such a crybaby, but it turned out that he did have a little piece of shell fragment in the bone, which brought on gangrene, and they had to amputate his leg a few days later. After spending a month wavering between life and death, he was sent back to his village, Rieux-Minervois. Taut was 41 years old. How many there were, 10 or 15 years younger than he was, who had never laid eyes on a trench. The Périacois Gabriel Gilles, at the moment when the big shell hit, was obeying a call of nature a few steps behind the trench. He got a shell fragment in his back, which he will keep his whole life as a souvenir of this tragic night. A few days later, this fragment brought on a pulmonary congestion, which put his life in great danger. Geordie, formerly of Périac, got a shell fragment in a knee, on which I put a rudimentary dressing. Sergeant Baruteau, who was sleeping while sitting on the firing step, had his legs torn up. Other soldiers from the 14th Squad, sitting or lying on the firing step, were also wounded. In all, this one shell claimed 15 or so victims. Once again, I had been warned in a way by this kind of instinctive intuition, which I had already felt several times previously. Like all who were not standing watch, I went to find a spot to sleep on the firing step, but a sudden idea came to me to stretch out at the bottom of the trench, although I risked being trampled by the boots of passers-by. But shell fragments couldn't reach me there. The Périacois Allard had a close call. A fragment struck and shattered the hilt of his bayonet, which he had on the ground right beside him. It should have been on the end of his rifle. This infraction of the rules may have saved his life. Meanwhile, out of all these wounded men, none dared to go to the first aid station. With a brute-like medical officer, Major Torres on duty, you couldn't go up to him with a simple scratch. We all knew what he sometimes said to the wounded and the sick. Even if you came to me holding your head in your hands, I wouldn't pay any attention to you. But on the other hand, when they would bring him a man who was too gravely wounded, he would burst into a rage because his medical skills would be useless and he'd be wasting his time. To leave the front line without being evacuated or medically recognized risked a court-martial. Oh, we were doing just fine, under the boot of militarism. But we couldn't keep all these wounded in the trench with us. Sub-Lieutenant Malvesi took it upon himself to convey them to the nearest field station, where, by a lucky chance, Torres was nowhere to be seen. And after a flurry of handshakes and embraces, as these would no doubt be definitive separations, we parted company with saddened hearts. The wounded disappeared at the turn of the boyau, hobbling along and helping one another. Into a shell crater we threw torn-up equipment, shredded knapsacks, broken rifles which littered the ground. With our shovels we got rid of the blood-soaked mud upon which swarms of flies had descended. Now the trench was clean. Nothing remained to remind us of the frightful drama of the night before. Soon the ravitailleur Therese arrived. He had left early in the evening and knew nothing about what had happened. He ran into me first. When he saw me with blood splattered on my face, my hands all over my clothing, he went pale and staggered against the side of the trench. "Did something bad happen to you?" he said. I told him all the details about what had happened. Then he gave us our rations, which we ate with an appetite that you can imagine. At 10 in the evening, the 281st Infantry Regiment from our division came to our relief, and 3 hours later we arrived at our billets at Hersin-Coupigny. Hersin-Coupigny is a big mining town. Yesterday it was a village. Today it is almost a prosperous city, as long as the Germans don't reduce it to ashes. It's within the range of their cannons, which from time to time send over volleys of shells. We were lodged in a dance hall, a place of pleasure changed into a human stable. But even in the worst stable there's a bit of straw. In ours we had to lie on a brick floor. At the cemetery at Hersin we gathered around the grave of our unlucky comrade Favier, who had gotten some rest, the biggest rest you can get, before we ever did. 3 days later, we went to camp in the corons of Saint-Angehel, and the next day to Bully-Grenay. We were like the wandering Jew, condemned to wander ceaselessly. We were going from purgatory to hell, and from hell back to purgatory. The village of Bully-Grenay, right at the threshold of the trenches, was bombarded daily. But how could we complain when the inhabitants didn't flee? If their houses collapsed, they settled in their cellars or took refuge with a neighbour. During one of our stays there, a whole family, except the father, was wiped out. But this catastrophe wasn't enough to incite the inhabitants to leave. At Bully, the 21st Company received a small number of replacements who were apportioned among the squads. In the 13th, we got 2 strapping lads who knew nothing about the trenches except what they'd seen in the illustrated newspapers. The squad also got reinforced with a priest, the Abbé Galop, who had been expelled from France by the laws of separation, and had come back from Egypt, where he'd been teaching in a religious school, to defend his homeland which had exiled him. Now that had merit. But we lost the Periacoa Allard. He got a job as a driver, which his age, 41, entitled him to. On July 10th at 9 in the evening, we left Bully and went up to occupy a second-line trench for 4 days. The bombardments had noticeably diminished. It was almost a sector for rest. But on July 14th, all that was spoiled. To remind the Germans that this was our national holiday, at 3 in the afternoon, our artillery unleashed a violent cannonade upon the opposing trenches. We would have done better to leave the Germans alone, because they replied in kind, not on our artillerymen, which would have been logical, but on us infantrymen, who had nothing to do with it. Stuck out there all by ourselves, the 13th Squad occupied a section of abandoned trench. In an instant, the shells began to rain down around us. Not having any shelters to seek refuge in, I thought it most prudent for the squad to immediately leave the position. Only Father Galop, as we called him, refused to follow. On his knees, resigned to his death, he was reciting the act of contrition. It was in vain that I told him the story of the schoolteacher Mondes, who died because he wouldn't follow the rest of us. This headstrong abbé didn't want to know anything about it, and stayed there by himself. As for the 2 other newcomers, they were terrified, completely lost. They didn't know where to take themselves. When we came back, we noticed that shells had fallen near our position, and one had landed right in the middle of the trench. Father Galop was safe and sound and still praying. "Now it's to thank God for saving my life, a real miracle," he said. Thunder mixed its voice with the cannon fire, and soon the rain came down in sheets, finally appeasing the rage of the artillerymen. In the company there were only a few wounded, and 1 soldier was killed in his hole and buried at the same time, by a gravedigger shell. The rain didn't stop. Night arrived, but our relief did not. Packs hoisted, we waited, silent, immobile, dripping with water, attentive to the slightest sound of footsteps. Finally, at 10 in the evening, our replacements arrived. They had gotten lost in the darkness, in the communication trenches transformed into sewers. And we got lost too. We slogged along for 6 hours through water and mud, covering maybe 15 or 20 kilometres, while there was only 1 kilometre as the crow flies to reach the 3rd line, where we had just spent 4 days. At daybreak we came out into a long, narrow field, surrounded by the network of trenches. This was the Tranchée Carbonnière. They should have called it Cimetière Cemetery, because every day they buried the dead of the sector there. Despite the large size of the field, it risked becoming too small to hold both the living and the dead. It will be a macabre surprise for those who come back here to cultivate their fields and find cemeteries instead. We were very disappointed to observe that there were no shelters at all. We camped out in the open, under the sun and the stars, life in the outdoors in the fullest sense of the word. With our shirts soaked with rain and sweat, gripped with cold, some yielded to their fatigue, and even fell asleep curled up on their packs or lying in the mud. The newspapers constantly praised the care and attention of our commanders toward their men. For the months that the Tranchée Carbonnière had been used as a reserve position, no one had thought to put up a couple of shelters. Nevertheless, there were some of them, occupied of course exclusively by officers, these modern-day noblemen. As for the soldiers, in the mud. However, not all philosophically accepted their fate. A good-sized group gathered in front of the shelter of our provisional company commander, the crazy Sub-Lieutenant Caminard. Shouts and protests burst forth. A few daring souls called for the singing of the Internationale, the supreme cry of revolt for the poilus. Hearing this racket, the famous Caminard burst from his hole in anger. "What is this all about?" he said. "You're complaining, and you're not wrong to do so. But what do you want? We're at war." And with this cynical word, which excused so many inexcusable things during the war, His Honour Caminard disappeared back into his hole, where he could rest while the sergeant of the day handed out work details. As for me, I had to head out with a crew of 20 men to take water to Bully Grenay, about 2 kilometres away by communication trench. This wasn't such a pleasant chore, with 2 men carrying a 50-litre keg of water suspended from a pole. How many curses arose when we had to make a sharp turn, or when we got stuck without being able to go forward or backward, or when the prickly barbed wire hanging over the top of the trench forced us to walk at a half-crouch, or when we had to make our way through narrow passages right on top of each other. What an accursed chore, which made the communication trenches seem interminable. For 3 nights we were employed hauling heavy beams and rafters from a mine, about 7 or 8 kilometres from the front line. The mine was called the Fosse Calonne Pit, and was bombarded day and night with high-caliber shells, fragments from which reached us. Since we were so loud in our demands for shelters, we were now building them, but they were for our successors. At the Fosse Calonne there was enough lumber available to furnish a whole town. The Germans also knew about this precious resource, and they were jealous. That's what brought on these frequent barrages, which made the neighbourhood very dangerous. Up to this point, no chief had wanted to risk his men's lives to collect this wood. Caminarde risked ours, without the slightest scruple. But at least we had no one wounded, and when we moved on from the Carbonnière, we left behind some good-sized shelters, almost completed. On July 18th, at 1 in the morning, our battalion arrived at Hersin-Coupigny to spend 7 days of rest. Clearly they were spoiling us. We were billeted by squad in the corons of the miners. Each coron had a little enclosure for storing coal, doing the wash, etc. That was our lodging. It was tight, and we had to sleep right next to each other, head to feet, as they say rudely. But that was a minor detail, and we were worn out by our night march, so we slept late until about 9 in the morning. Once we had rested and cleaned up a bit, the 2 oldest veterans of the squad, Eriks and Lepere, invited me to go with them to the end of the road that met the main road passing through the village. At this crossroads, the company's field kitchen had set up shop in the open air. I was ready to follow my 2 buddies when, all of a sudden, I was overcome by an indefinable sensation of worry, anguish, fear. I was sure of it. This was the imminence of danger which I was feeling. Dogs know when their masters are about to die, and they know when they themselves are going to die, I'm sure. The schoolteacher Mundys, and many others whom I've known, have sensed their imminent doom. Many have escaped death, guided by intuition that they didn't even know they had. Everything may depend on the degree of sensitivity of our nerves, or how impressionable they are. But on this day, I thought that my intuition must be wrong. What danger could land on me? We weren't in the sinister Fond de Bouval. We were in a calm and peaceful village. The street was bustling with activity. Children were playing, housewives were gossiping at their doorsteps, non-coms flirted with pretty blondes. I held back from telling my 2 comrades what I was feeling. They would have made fun of me. But I didn't follow them, with the excuse that I had something to do. But to flee this unknown danger, should I stay in the cantonment or go away from it? I followed an impulse to go into a shop where postcards with scenes of Hersin were for sale. Up until now, the censors had prohibited them from being sold. With Private Ventresque, I went into this shop. We picked out a couple of scenes, some of which appear in this notebook, and we were on our way out when suddenly a series of explosions could be heard. A volley of powerful, timed fuse shells had just fallen on Hersin. Next to the shop was a little courtyard with a skylight roof. A big shell fragment shattered it, producing a shower of broken glass. The terrified shopkeeper and her family fled down a staircase into the basement. If we'd been of a more larcenous mind, we could have helped ourselves to plenty of treats in the shop, but we rushed back to our billet. There we learned that 3 powerful shells had fallen right onto the crossroads where our field kitchen stood. The 4 cooks were critically injured. The kitchen had its chimney knocked off, and the cooking pot was blown apart. We would go hungry that day. Eric's had such a serious wound to his arm that it had to be amputated. Lapierre was badly wounded in the leg. A shell fragment had sliced off as neatly as a pastry slicer, a piece of his calf as big as a chestnut, and the blood poured out like a fountain. In all, the company had 12 wounded men, all of whom had been standing around the field kitchen, chatting away. Very luckily, less than 100 meters away was a military hospital where the wounded were taken quickly and given immediate attention. The next day, when we went to this hospital for news of Lapierre and Eric's, we found the doors locked. Because of the bombardment, they had evacuated all the wounded during the night and closed down the hospital. Therefore, of all the veterans of the 13th Squad, I was the only one left still fighting, along with Rationer Therese. All the others were killed or wounded. When would my turn come? Until the end of August, we shuttled between Hersin, Saint-Zongohel, Bully-Grenay, and the trenches. Gradually, the sector quieted down, and we wouldn't have traded this corner of the front for any other, for fear of falling into a bad spot. On August 27th, we were in Saint-Zongohel, and we had to go up to the front line that evening. But during the day, a dramatic counter-order pulled us out of the sector altogether. Our departure was set for 2 a.m. We passed through the sleeping towns of Hersin and Barlin, the village of Mesnil, which had been completely destroyed by an exploding ammunition dump, and the big mining centre of Bruay. Next came Divion, and then, fairly worn out by an 8-hour march with only a mug of coffee in our bellies, we arrived at Camblain-Châtelain. 3 days later, at noon, we boarded railroad cars at the Pernay-Camblain station, our musette bags filled with indigestible biscuits and cans of singe, monkey meat, enough for 3 more days. Where the devil were they taking us in such a hurry? The train departed, heading north. We passed by Hazebrook, and at 8 p.m. we disembarked at the station of Bergues, 6 kilometres from Dunkirk. We were hoping to be billeted in this good-sized town of Bergues, but to our great disappointment we crossed it without stopping and forged ahead into the dark of night across an endless plain, the plain of Flanders. The road seemed interminable. We marched and marched. The packs grew more and more terribly heavy on our shoulders. Finally, we stopped at a village. At the entrance was the usual sentinel who observed us parade by. Passing him, I asked him the name of the village. He threw me back a tongue-twister of a name, but it mattered only if we were halting there. But this wasn't to be our stopping place. The wandering battalion launched itself once again onto the vast plain, shrouded in darkness. To make things worse, the weather turned rainy, and more laggards fell further behind the column of march. In the darkness you could hear murmurs and shouts. The officers played deaf. They knew that the men hadn't had anything warm to eat or drink since morning, and they themselves had plenty. Those who were being paid had no right to complain. At the head of our column marched our new commandant, named Leblanc. He was small, thin, and scrawny. A wag had baptized him Kinsgrams, 15 grams, half pint, which was an immediate success. He would never be called anything else by the irreverent soldiers. It was he who was leading us. But the poor guy read his map like a carp reading a prayer book. Leaving the village we had just crossed, we should have turned left, but he had us go right. That was his big mistake. He should have gotten information from the ridiculous watchwoman. For once in her life she could have been of some use, but no doubt his dignity wouldn't permit it. He would have had to admit that he couldn't make sense of his map and compass. As a result, in the middle of a rainstorm, around 1 in the morning, we found ourselves in a field where the road we were on ended. I heard the commandant admit, pitifully, "I think that we might be lost." He was still not entirely convinced of it. He sent scouts out, left and right, to find a farm where he could seek refuge with his officers. As for us, he generously granted us the liberty of sleeping in a muddy field to await the coming day. We discovered nearby a big barn which Providence seemed to have placed there just for us. It's true that it was open to the elements on all four sides, the roof resting upon 4 old posts stuck in the ground. Nearby were some haystacks. In the blink of an eye they were pillaged, and in less than a quarter of an hour the sound of heavy snoring emanated from the barn. Practically the whole battalion was camped out there, the men burrowed into a thick bed of hay. I don't recall sleeping better my whole life, but I do recall being roughly shaken awake by angry voices which showered us with curses. These were the voices of the owners of the hay, expressing a rightful rage, but not one sleeper budged. We offered in opposition the strength of our inertia. Only a few voices, with accents of the Paris faubourgs, working-class neighbourhoods, responded with classic disrespectful wisecracks. "Shut up, you old stove! Take a hike! To the showers!" Soon our Commandant Leblanc appeared, white with rage, and obliged us to put the haystacks back in place, calming somewhat the irascible Flemings. 3 hours later we arrived at the village of Oostkappel, neighbour of Westkappel. We were lodged by units in farms, spaced 200 or 300 metres from one another. Our unit was assigned to the Killam farm, in an old sheepfold. A dilapidated, hole-covered partition separated us from the pig pen, where 4 or 5 noisy and quarrelsome piglets kept jarring us awake with their sharp cries. The Reverend Father Galop, a bit less resigned than Job on his dung-heap, cried out with his hands joined in prayer, "Lying on the hard ground in a sheepfold is nothing. Jesus was born in a stable. But it's this foul odour that makes me sick, and this coating of pig-shit slurry spreading all over the floor, turning our straw bed into a stinking manure pile." In fact, after 3 nights I couldn't take it anymore, and I went outside and found a spot under a threshing machine in a barn. We also suffered from a lack of drinking water. It's not that there was a drought. To the contrary, torrential downpours came frequently. But the next day there wouldn't be a trace of the rain. I prefer our sunny south to this Flanders, which, although fertile, lacked the green ribbon of our streams and rivers, our capricious waterfalls, and the oases of our springs of fresh, bubbling water. To remove the dirt from our hands and faces each day, they had to bring water in kegs. As for our shirts and our clothes, we had to wash them in ponds, which are a feature of all the farms of northern France. The water in them is generally dirty and polluted. The pigs, cows and horses would refuse outright to drink it. These beasts were lucky enough to be immune to typhoid fever and other pernicious diseases. Sometimes in the evening we would go to the nearby village of Oostkappel, despite the prohibition which had been issued. The border followed the road which cuts right through the village, so that half of Oostkappel is French and the other half is Belgian. The only difference you notice was that the shop windows on the Belgian side were piled high with pyramids of tobacco packets and cigar boxes, freely for sale. It was a paradise for the smokers and chewers, because the prices were laughably low. Every morning we went out on elaborate field exercises and long marches. The afternoons were given over to obligatory games of football, parallel bars, races, etc. Even the grandfathers of 40, 43, or even 44 years old, whom we had among us, joined in willingly. Some of a more morose spirit wanted to stay out of such childish games, but our new captain, Cromerevier, made them do calisthenics instead, running wind sprints without taking breaks, so that they would appreciate the appeal of these games. The choice was theirs. At that time, the farmers were harvesting the hops. One day, one of our bosses had the bright idea of issuing an order at roll call, authorizing us to help harvest the hops that afternoon. We would be paid 1 sou per kilo. It was enticing. We would fill our pocketbooks. But alas, our maladroit hands couldn't gather up enough for more than 7 or 8 sous an afternoon. It was small change, but it kept us out of our captain's clutches. To win the favour of the Flemish girls, the young poilus posted themselves alongside them and helped them fill their sacks. And these young people, carefree as they have always been and always will be, sang, laughed, flirted and embraced, indifferent to the dull roar of cannon fire which sounded over toward Ypres. For me, as an old papa, every afternoon I went to the aid of 2 old folks whose poverty obliged them to come from several kilometres away to gain their livelihood, a pretty meagre one, even counting the few sous which my help added to their earnings. One morning, coming back from the stupid daily drill, Sub-Lieutenant Malvesi, chief of our section and commander of the Kilem farm billet, stopped me at the entrance to our sheepfold, our sleeping quarters, and in a roguish manner ordered me out into a nearby field. Sub-Lieutenant Malvesi was, before the war, a simple employee of the Oder departmental tramways. He hadn't earned his stripes by some gallant battlefield exploit destined to be inscribed in the history books. No, he had earned them in the Narbonne garrison. To fill up vacancies, they had promoted to officers some sergeants from older conscript classes who were growing stale in the garrison. They didn't want to promote the ones who were at the front, because they were too friendly with the enlisted men. They were afraid that these non-coms wouldn't have enough authority over the men when they had to send them to their slaughter. That's how the road worker Malvesi became our section chief. Not mean-spirited, but swollen with pride, he was always getting back at us for the lack of respect we showed him, by little vexations. When we were a little ways off, he told me, in the tone of a schoolteacher reprimanding a student, "Corporal Barthas, I'm not happy with you. It appears to me that you're giving anti-militarist ideas to your comrades. You're demoralizing them instead of boosting their morale. I was a socialist too, but now we all have to do our duty." "Excuse me, Lieutenant," I replied forcefully. "Can you tell me where and when I have not done my duty? What words are you accusing me of having said to my comrades?" Without answering my question, Malvesi added, "And your squad isn't marching very well. Today, in the assault at Rexpoade, a laughable assault, your men were the last ones to arrive." "Hold on. You know well that the tailor Moulis is crippled with rheumatism, and that little Pelissier excretes blood every day. Father Galop has a hernia as big as a sugar loaf, Therese has asthma, and old Chapman has a son in the trenches and is going nuts about it. And you want me to force these poor devils to run, to jump, to do more than they're able to do? No, never. And if it's these lousy corporal's stripes that you want, take them from me whenever you'd like. They don't mean anything to me." "Fine," said Malvesi. "I'll talk about it with the captain." "Talk about it with General Joffre if you want to," I said as I headed off. There was evidently a snitch among us whom we had to watch out for. Our suspicions fell on Sergeant F., who from that day was ostracized by the 13th Squad. From then on, Malvesi showed no ill will toward me. To the contrary, he seemed to want to remedy the injury he had done to me, or thought he had done me. He was going on leave a few days later, and since there was no sergeant present in the section, there had to be a corporal named to take over the command in his absence. I was quite surprised when the sub-lieutenant, calling me forward, told me that it was up to me to command the 4th section. Was he making fun of me? But no, this was serious, and despite my excuses, I had to, willingly or not, take on the military command of the Kilem farm. Decadence and grandeur. While we were at rest in Belgium, we received reinforcements from a regiment which was less battle-tested than the 280th. Of course, they sent us not the elite, but the rejects. In the 13th Squad, they assigned us Privates Chapman and Lefebvre, both from Calais. The first was tall, scrawny, old, and constantly in a funk about his oldest son, who was in the trenches in an assault regiment. The second was a sailor, robust, stocky, clever. He would have made a good soldier if it weren't for his weakness for the pignard, cheap red wine, or for any fermented drink, which led him often to drunkenness. On September 12th, we changed our billet. We went about 5 kilometres to a farm between Oostkapelle and Rexpoade. Every day now was taken up with marches and grand manoeuvres directed by the famous General Niesel, a brawler who dreamed of nothing but combats and assaults. We didn't know what it meant that we were being assigned to this sabre-rattler. He was quickly baptized General Tenglandi, Occitan dialect expression meaning, "I'm going to beat you up." On September 20th, in the afternoon, all the non-coms and corporals who had been sent for 2 weeks of training in handling grenades and other advanced, that's to say more homicidal, weaponry at Souilly suddenly came back. This signified that our vacation had come to an end. In fact, the order for departure was set for that very evening at 11 o'clock. At assembly, Private Lefebvre, whom no one had seen since supper, was absent. We finally found him dead drunk beside a pond. You can imagine the trouble this drunkard gave us in getting him to follow us all the way to Berg, where we would embark for a destination unknown to any of us. We arrived there at 1 in the morning. We stacked our rifles in the streets, with orders not to wander off since we would be leaving at any minute. This minute arrived at 7 o'clock. For 6 hours we languished, stretched out on the pavement, doing everything we could think of to stay warm, because a whitish sleet was falling, something that we had never seen in the Midi this time of year. Who had given this stupid order to leave 8 hours early to catch a train only 6 kilometers away? Finally, around 7, here we are embarking for an unknown destination. Near the station we saw some big holes. 2 months ago the Germans, testing things out at the same time as they were bombarding Dunkirk, had sent, postage paid, a gift package of 14 enormous 450mm shells, fired from a distance of 37 kilometers. Passing by Verquet, we could hear a hellish cannonade. They told us that 3 British armoured trains were firing on La Bassée, Lens and Liévin. At 11 a.m. we halted at Saint-Paul. This was our unknown destination. Right away, packs on our backs, here we are, heading out along a dusty road in torrid weather, to arrive later that afternoon in the little village of Écouvre. Our section was badly housed, a dark, cramped and filthy compound. Facing us were 3 pig pens, 2 of which were occupied by quadrupeds, the middle one of which was empty. I set myself up there with a comrade. We didn't do too badly, despite the grunts of our neighbours and the huge rats that devoured the contents of our musette bags during the night. The farm folk weren't very welcoming. They padlocked the pump at the well, which made it very difficult for us to get water to drink and to shave with. Boy, did our bosses take good care of us. On September 23rd at 4 in the afternoon, the regiment was assembled and massed in a square in a meadow. Our Colonel Pujal announced what we already knew, that a general offensive was going to be unleashed, that at this moment the Russians were falling back, but while most of the Germans were bogged down in Poland, we would crush them on our front. "And now," he cried in a loud voice, "forward! No more hernias, no more weak hearts, no more aches and pains, nothing but the will to win. Vive la France!" This patriotic nonsense didn't arouse the slightest enthusiasm. We hadn't forgotten the horrors of the last offensive of Lorette. An impressive silence greeted the colonel's final words. Only the undertaker Torres smiled. He nodded his head as if to say, "Yes, let the herniated, the weak-hearted, the sciatics come to me. They'll get a nice reception." The next night, at 3 in the morning in rainy weather, we left Écouvre and headed in the direction of Arras. As morning came, the weather became hot and heavy, which made the march even more tiring. We crossed the little town of Avesnes-le-Comte, and at 1 in the afternoon the regiment stopped to encamp in the little village of Habak, 12 kilometers from Arras. At least half of our unit was still in the rear. The road was packed with laggards. Nobody bothered them. You knew that the docile sheep would arrive at the slaughterhouse on time. We could hear a violent cannonade all along the front. You couldn't make out individual cannons firing. It was more like an uninterrupted roar, like in a violent storm when the single claps of thunder, close together, form a continuous rumbling sound. They called the corporals to the company office. "How many men in your squad?" asked the officer. 14, Chief." "Well, here, take these 14 cutlasses. Give one of them to each man." "These are arms for murderers, not for soldiers," I exclaimed. "It matters little to me," said the officer, pushing me out the door, "and keep your opinions to yourself." "No, I won't keep these reflections to myself, and I'll explain it to my comrades, the way it was clearly told elsewhere, that they were for finishing off the wounded and for killing prisoners." "Well, my cutlass won't be used for such crimes," I told them, and right in front of everybody I tossed mine up onto the roof of an adjacent house. Almost everyone got rid of theirs, and no one asked what happened to them. Only Sub-Lieutenant Malvesi in the 4th section, our wild Tatar, took the biggest cutlass and carried it ostentatiously hooked to his belt. Before supper, our officers got orders to stuff our heads about how an incalculable number of cannon were pounding, clobbering the German front, destroying everything from the North Sea all the way to Belfort. All the French, Belgian and English troops would rise up at the same time and rush out in pursuit of the few miserable Boches who had escaped being massacred by our artillery. Our division didn't have the honor of being in the first wave. Its role was pursuit, capturing the fleeing enemy, and the next day we'd be drinking an aperitif in German-occupied Douai, the regiment's objective. This time it was for real. Open field warfare was beginning again. It was so certain that they gave us squares of white cloth to attach to our packs, so that our airplanes and our artillerymen could better distinguish us from afar. In brief, they were telling us that it was going to be a picnic. Next came a generous distribution of grenades, cartridges, biscuits, tools, sandbags, etc. 20 times were the corporals called to the distribution centres. At 10 in the evening we were stuffing our packs and our musette bags, and at 1 in the morning the 280th Regiment headed off to the trenches in complete silence. Everyone was thinking about the anguish and suffering he would be going through, either once again or for the first time. After around 2 hours on the march, we arrived at the village of Mareuil, 6 kilometres from Arras. We crossed this half-demolished little town, and they made us stack our rifles in a field beside a blasted factory where they made corduroy cloth. A little river, subsequently sadly renowned by the terrible combats which blooded its banks, ran across the field. This was the Scarpe, which flowed slowly and quietly, but with difficulty, through the plain of Arras. They warned us not to leave our groups or dismount our equipment. Our dash to Douai in pursuit of the fleeing enemy was imminent. Dawn rose on this historic day, September 25th. A gigantic battle was about to be engaged, across an immense front. Millions of men, whole peoples, whole races were going to clash with each other. Thousands of fiery mouths of guns had been spitting lead and steel for 3 days without ceasing. In the final hours before H-hour, the fateful minute, the cannonade reached its climax, making the earth tremble, shaking the air, gripping our souls with an uncertain terror, with a fear that we couldn't put aside. There was no sun of Austerlitz, but rather heavy showers which fell intermittently, without our having the slightest shelter under which to keep ourselves out of it. There were fine shelters in the village, but only the officers found refuge there. Right behind us, on the other side of the river, on a railroad track, an armoured train with naval guns began firing right at daybreak, with a clockwork regularity as if at a target shoot. At each detonation it seemed like our guts and our brains were going to burst. During all this, bits of encouraging news were circulated, to inspire our warrior spirit and our patriotic zeal. In Champagne they were making marmalade of the Boche. On our left, the English had taken Loos in a single grab. In front of us, the first enemy line was captured in one bound. Now they were going to attack the second line. Watch out, our turn was coming soon. In fact, at noon, the blast of a whistle brought us all to our feet. This was the signal for us to start in pursuit. Our legs were going to work. As we left the village near the cemetery, we entered a wide and well-built communication trench, studded with recent shell craters. We stepped over busted canteens, torn open and shredded packs, broken and twisted rifles. These were worrisome paving stones. We tramped cautiously through the black mud. This boyau was a bad place for a stroll. Each one of us, feeling oppressed and pessimistic, marched forward silently, with our heads down. The bombardment was angrier than ever. Across the whole front, the cannon fire rumbled. The machine guns let forth their chilling, murderous rat-tat-tat. The great battle was engaged. Death was reaping with great sweeps of his scythe. Meanwhile, ahead of us, the forward momentum of our troops, having crossed the front line, was stopped by the fierce resistance of the Germans. Luckily, our General Niesel had a brilliant idea. Since we couldn't make the Germans leave with cannon blows, let's make them flee out of sheer terror. And immediately the order was given to climb out of the trenches and to march across the open country, bayonets fixed to our rifle barrels. The whole division was there. It was a true forest of bayonets marching forward. And that wasn't all. The division's cavalry squadron rushed forward in a furious charge, came back and circled on a hill around a clearing to give the impression of greater numbers. But it did no good. The Boche stood their ground in their trenches, desperately, as if they were fighting on their home ground. Some timed fuse shells exploding here and there over our heads made us crouch down in the communication trenches, without waiting for the authorization of the stupid General Niesel. whom, for my part, I didn't see at all that day. They made us stop in an old abandoned trench where the whole regiment dug in. This was an historic trench. We were in what had been the German front line at the time of our May offensive, when the nearby villages of Neuville-Saint-Vaast and Ablain-Saint-Nazaire were retaken. Would we be in this trench for a day, a night, an hour? No one knew. General Niesel, right then, gave an order which was terrible for the rear echelon shirkers. Orderlies, cooks, rationers, etc. received the order to rejoin their units. That's how the 13th Squad was reinforced with the Périacois François Maisonneuve, who carried out the precious duties of assistant cook and rationer at the officers' mess. Niesel wanted everyone to get a share of the glory, but if you saw the terrified and discomfited faces of these slackers, you would see that they'd have 1,000 times preferred to stay with their pots and pans. And night fell. We wouldn't be enjoying an aperitif in Douai, as they had promised us. Instead, we had for free some nice refreshing showers, because all night long a cold rain fell in torrential downpours, and without any shelter for us to dry out in. We were resigned to getting soaked right through our shirts. You have to have lived through nights like that to appreciate, on a winter night, a well-lit room, a good fire in the fireplace, and a warm, soft bed. Thoughts of those enviable things played upon our imagination. If we suffered so stoically, without raising useless complaints, don't let anyone tell you that it was because of patriotism, or to defend the rights of peoples to live their own lives, or to end all wars or other nonsense. It was simply by force, because as victims of an implacable fate we had to undergo our destiny. Each one of us was caught up in the wheels of a formidable machine. At the slightest hint of revolt, we would be ground to bits. Having lost our dignity and our human conscience, we were nothing more than beasts of burden. Like them, we were passive, indifferent, and dazed. And my comrades in the squad, what did they say? What were they thinking in this gloomy night, in the icy rain? Father Galop couldn't read his breviary, but he fumbled with his rosary beads in his frost-bitten fingers. We talked, and he told me that he was offering his sufferings to God in penitence for the expiation of his sins, and he was sure that this would shorten his time in purgatory. This man was almost happy in his suffering. I envy him, because I doubt that some invisible being in this opaque night is out there tallying up our sufferings and taking exact note of them for the hereafter. I turn toward Lefebvre, and I envy him too. Having drunk a bottle of Pinard to the last drop, he's sleeping, even snoring, desensitized in the sleep of drunkenness, and that one who's sobbing, that's Chapman. He thinks only about his son who was in the attack today in Champagne. Is he dead, wounded, or alive right now? That's his whole thought, and he's indifferent to everything else, his own suffering and the dangers he himself faces. I try to comfort him, but he doesn't even hear me. And poor Pélissier from La Palme, small, sickly, scrawny, a wreck, he is slumped in the boyau, without the strength even to speak. The Périacois Maisonneuve does nothing but rage all night long against Niesel, and the others who didn't spend the last winter in the trenches don't dare to complain, understanding what the veterans have suffered before them. Only the rationer Thérisse slept. He had the rare ability of being able to sleep in any kind of place, no matter what the circumstances. And yet this night, the deaf themselves could not have slept. Barely 100 meters behind us was installed a battery of big artillery pieces which fired all night long. The whistling of the shells overhead kept our nerves on edge. The shells seemed to rush by, right above our trenches, making us duck our heads instinctively. Finally, we got used to the noise, but we were also kept awake all night long by the lightning flashes from the cannons' mouths as the shells were fired. At about 1 a.m. they summoned the rationers to head to the field kitchens to get our supper. But in this dark night the cooks were looking blindly for the rationers and vice versa. The result of this game of hide-and-seek was that the men with the food didn't arrive until just before dawn, more soaked with rain and sweat than the miserable meals they brought us. The loaves of bread were transformed into loaves of mud. The coffee was cold. Very little comfort after such a bad night. The morning of the 26th was rainy, but around noon the weather improved. They took advantage of it by restarting the carnage all along the front. Packs hoisted, all kitted out, We awaited orders, just like the actors in a theatre waiting their turn to go on stage. At 4 p.m. we had a visit from Commandant Kinsgram, his acolyte Capitaine Adjutant, Major Cros-Merivier, and the battalion's adjutant, the Peririacois François Calvet. Except for the non-coms, no one saluted them. Their uniforms and effects were dry and spotless. "The bastards found some kind of shelter to keep themselves in," said Therese. He had spent half the night in rain-soaked terrain and couldn't hide his ill humour. My countryman Calvet stopped to give me a handshake, but at this moment an orderly, with dispatch in hand, all excited, asked where he could find the commandant. We shuddered. This scrap of paper no doubt held our destiny. In fact, the commandant read it out in a loud voice, and I caught a few snatches of significant words. "Our troops have taken the trench of Les Tilleuls. The 280th Regiment will take the communication trench at La Targette. The attack on Farbus will be pushed to the limit. Pushed to the limit." That meant, pay no attention to losses. Take this village, whatever the cost. Too bad for those who left their hides there. That's war. General Niesel was just doing his job by sending us to the killing fields. A quarter of an hour later, the 280th Regiment made its way up through the communication trenches to the front lines. We passed through the ruined village of La Targette. Then we got caught up in an entanglement of trenches, crossing and recrossing the same places without finding the right path. We came upon men, isolated or in small groups, heading to the rear. Most gave no response to our questions. Others exclaimed, the poor guys," or "It's horrible, frightful." They seemed half crazy. Nobody had heard anything about Farbus. We began to think that this village existed only in the imagination of General Niesel. Soon whole battalions and companies were getting mixed up in an inextricable confusion, and the regiment didn't reach the front lines until 1 in the morning, in a state of extreme fatigue. For 9 hours we hadn't taken the packs off of our afflicted shoulders. There was a long halt. Most of the men were falling down and immediately going to sleep, when our Colonel Pujal ran into another colonel, 20 steps from where our squad was. We heard our colonel cry out in a loud voice, "Nevertheless, I have a direct order from General Niesel to attack Farbus tonight." "But that's insane!" exclaimed the other colonel. "Our division has been wiped out without taking the second German line, and you're planning to go take Farbus, somewhere out there, who knows where. The best thing for you to do," added the colonel, "would be to fall back on Neuville-Saint-Vaast, about 1,500 metres from here." What can one think about this General Niesel, who sent his regiments out in a night like this, so dark that you couldn't see a cow at 2 paces, to attack a village in the rear of the enemy lines? Were we in the hands of a dangerous maniac, a total madman, completely unbalanced in the head? How reassuring. The regiment did fall back on Neuville-Saint-Vaast, where we arrived at dawn. Since 4 o'clock the previous afternoon we had been tramping around in the muddy trenches. 14 hours to cover a trajectory which, in a straight line, would have taken an hour and a half.